I should say that this is really the British version of the forthcoming American presidential debates, although Roger Scruton is infinitely more intelligent than Mitt Romney, and I am infinitely more left-wing than Barack Obama, neither of which is at all difficult. I want just to begin by very quickly sketching in 4 momentous developments in culture, as I see it, over about the last 100 years. It won't take as long as that makes it sound, yes, but it will. The first is, in the early 20th century, something very dramatic happens to culture, namely, it becomes for the first time, really, a full-blooded industry. Yes? The so-called culture industry, as people like Adorno will later call it, gets off the ground. In other words, culture really, for the first time in a very big way, becomes part of commodity production in general. Yes? Now, second momentous development, which is really in line with this and extends it, several decades later, perhaps in the 1970s, the era of so-called postmodernism, now not only is culture itself a huge industry, enormously profitable, but other industries, other parts of society begin increasingly to assimilate and integrate it, become, as it were, culturalized or aestheticized in style, design, packaging, advertising, public relations, and so on. What happens then is an intensifying integration of culture and other kinds of social practice, which has the advantage, you might say, that it brings culture down to earth from its rather rarefied status otherwise, but has the distinct disadvantage that it means that culture gradually ceases to operate as critique, that one of the great traditional humanistic functions of culture was, as it were, to open up some daylight between itself and the rest of our social practices and institutions so that it could actually operate as a critique of them. That distance, as it increasingly narrows between culture and society, if you like, means that critique is increasingly muted and blunted, and that happens just in our own period at the same time as another dramatic event, a historic event, which is that the universities finally more or less cease to be centres of humane critique and capitulate almost without a struggle to the priorities of late capitalism. Yes? Those two things, the integration of culture, the culture ceasing to be a critique, and the universities increasingly capitulating these priorities, I think can be seen together. I was, about a year ago, being shown around what I was told was the greatest, the biggest anyway, maybe not greatest, university in South Asia by the president, who was proudly pointing out his business school and managerial courses and so on. And I said, there doesn't seem to be anything critical here. And he looked at me as though I'd said, where are the PhDs on pole dancing? And he said, your comment will be noted, rather stiffly, took out some small technological gadget, spoke 2 words into it, probably, kill him, closed it and put it away. Right. The third momentous development, which I think Roger in particular may want to engage with, is when culture ceases to be a surrogate for religion. Yes? You can write the history of modernity, among other things, in terms of a whole series of botched attempts by various things, the nation, the state, culture, and so on, to stand in for a failing religion. Culture was, in a way, a very plausible candidate, both culture in the narrow artistic sense and culture in the broader way of life, anthropological sense. What happens over the 20th century, I think, is that this becomes less and less plausible. The idea that the arts will save us, which in some ways is a theme of modernism, a theme of high modernism, is as it were, gradually discredited. There is an excellent book, actually not yet published, about to be published on this theme, full of brilliant insights, called Culture and the Death of God, written by me, which looks at this whole... in a rather dramatic way, culture made a bid for power, a bid, as it were, to oust God, to oust theology and religion. And that, wasn't a stupid idea, because culture is concerned with deep fundamental values, if you like, with a kind of transcendence, as well as with everyday practices like religion. It was in some ways a very plausible candidate to replace religion, but it didn't work for all kinds of reasons. The fourth dramatic development over that century, I think, is this, that let me put it this way, at a certain point, culture ceased to be part of the solution and became part of the problem. What I mean by that is that one rather generous-minded but somewhat hopelessly idealist version of culture had seen culture as the common ground on which we could all meet in our fundamental shared humanity, regardless of our rather trivial differences of gender, nationality, ethnicity, class, and so on. That was a rather abstract concept, and you needed to concretize it. You needed something you could, as it were, hold in your hand and say, this crystallizes, this distills those deep shared values. And the name of that was literature. Literature was a marvelously portable way, so to speak, of carrying this deep consensus of values around you. That was, in many ways, a very generous-minded and progressive idea in its time. What happens from the mid-20th century onwards is that that, too, becomes increasingly unviable. And the reason for that, I think, is this. The most wildly successful revolutionary movement of the modern period was revolutionary nationalism, which in the mid-decades, particularly of the 20th century, transfigured the earth, yes? For revolutionary nationalism, and for the various kinds of identity politics, so-called, that came after it, culture was now, as it were, part of the problem, not part of the solution. Culture in the broad sense of identity, language, symbol, daily practice, kinship, tradition, affiliation, community, all of these things were now politically problematic. Yes, they were the very language of conflict and contention, whereas culture traditionally, sometimes I think rather spuriously, had been an attempt to paper over those cracks and say, well, those divisions are not really as important as our shared humanity. What happened then was that culture became, as it were, the very language in which political demands were framed and articulated. Culture and politics became much closer together, and that meant that culture could no longer, as it were, take the high ground in relation to a politics which it had always been rather disdainful of, or rather suspicious of. In a word, and forgive me if you've heard me say this before, culture was now, and is for us today, what people are ready to kill for, or, if you like, to die for. Nobody, as far as I know, is prepared to kill for the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Maybe a few seriously weird people hanging around in caves somewhere, but they are most certainly prepared to kill for questions of religion, identity, community, ethnicity, lineage, and so on. Yes? That now, I think, is what has happened in the long trek from the beginning of the 20th century to the present. Culture is what people are prepared to kill for, and on that suitably somber note, I will hand you over to Roger Scruton, who will probably depress you even more.
Well, that was an extremely interesting survey of a particular view of what culture is and what it can do for us. I want to slightly change the focus towards thinking about how we actually would try to teach culture in the age in which we find ourselves, and why it might still be important. Terry has said some very important things, in fact, about the history of the culture industry in the last century. And I can't say that I disagree with everything that he says, although I think there's one very important remark that he makes which I would fundamentally disagree with, which is that his remark that the universities have capitulated to capitalism. As a unique defender of capitalism in my university, for which I was never rewarded, I can only say that that's the opposite of the truth. Where I taught in London University, everybody in the humanities departments and social sciences had capitulated to socialism. Many of them under the influence of Terry Eagleton. This put me in mind of a very important question, which is not only what is culture, but why should we teach it now, and how can we teach it? This is very important for people in the humanities, because that's how we defined our subjects. Terry taught and still teaches literature, which is, I guess, a part of culture. I teach philosophy, in particular those aspects of philosophy that border on the arts. And there is no point in teaching them if I don't think that there is something to be learned here. And what I think of there is to be learned is precisely that, culture. But what is it? I think there are two contrasting views, one which I defend, and one which I think Terry has defended in his writings over the years. I would say that culture, as we teach it in universities, is or aspires to be a form of wisdom that is to be imparted to people. That's to say, something which contains elements of knowledge which they wouldn't otherwise acquire, and which is imparted in its own particular way, not as the sciences are, but in another way, and it's that other way which is difficult to define. But there are those who teach in universities, in humanities departments, who see culture as something quite different. They see it as part of the ideology of the ruling class, or the ideology of a particular social order. And the purpose of teaching it is not to impart it, but on the contrary, to undermine it, or to expose the powers that secretly advance behind it. And I think that's that second approach is what started what I think of as the culture wars. The wars between those people who regarded their role as teachers of culture as one of imparting a form of wisdom, a form of knowledge that would be not only useful to the student, but part of the continuity of the social order to which the student belongs, and those who see their primary duty as one of debunking, deconstructing, or showing the structures of domination, to use the Foucauldian idiom, that lie behind our ways of thinking, our ways of speaking, and our ways of enjoying the art and music and so on of our civilization. The origin of that second view, the debunking view, is, I think, the Marxist theory of ideology, which became prominent not at the time that Marx wrote, but much later in the Frankfurt School in Germany and between the wars, and, of course, in the France of 1968 under the influence of people like Foucault. And I see Terry Eagleton's approach in his earlier writings, at least, as part of that, I have to say, a particularly intelligent manifestation of it, I'm afraid, so I can't easily triumph over it. But nevertheless, I do think that it's very important to reaffirm another vision of culture as something not only worth imparting, but also as containing knowledge. The kind of knowledge that it contains is not, like scientific knowledge, a collection of facts and theories. And when people start thinking of culture in terms of theory, it's largely because they're taking the Marxist approach of debunking it through finding the explanation of it. I think of culture as a form of practical knowledge, something which gives you a sense of what to do, what to feel, how to be towards other people in a community, in ways which will enhance your own social and emotional competence. I think this is what you learn from literature, and I think in particular you learn it from music. And if I've got just another minute or two, I'd like to mention this aspect of culture because it's so often overlooked. The greatest achievement of our civilization, if you leave religion and science to one side, has been music. A continuous tradition of reflection through the articulate sound on what it is to be human. and a constant attempt to take that reflection further, to build abstract structures in which nevertheless we see mirrored our own emotional nature as rational and social beings. And I think this great achievement is something which I think can be imparted to the young, and it changes their lives. It changes their way not only of thinking about the world, but of seeing each other. Nothing can be done to enhance this acculturation by giving a Marxist theory of where it all came from. Here is something which you impart by encouraging young people to love it and to find reflected in it all that is best in themselves. And that, I think, is what a real cultural education should be, imparting that kind of self-knowing and reflective conception of why one is the sort of thing one is and how to find it mirrored in the world around you. That's it.